This talk, as you see in the title, it's about contextualization. And what I'm actually doing in this presentation is drawing a lot of research, which I've been reading with interest on the history of computation and in science and technology studies. So I myself, I'm a philosopher of neuroscience and cognitive science, but in my previous job I was in a history and philosophy of science department, and so I was often teaching history of science, and that's what got me into this literature. And I find it really gives you an interestingly different perspective on this philosophical thesis, which is the computational theory of mind. So in this presentation, I'm going to be talking a fair bit about research done on this context by historians of science and people working on the sociology of science, but hopefully synthesizing it in a new way to bring in a philosophical point at the end. So what is the computational theory of mind? Well, this is like one of the core foundational assumptions of cognitive science as a discipline. It's the view that cognition is essentially computation, that thought is fundamentally a mechanical process, and that human intelligence is at least potentially replicable in a machine. So I wouldn't say that every working cognitive scientist would sign up to all of these things, but I would say that computation theory of cognition has been the dominant framework within cognitive science since the discipline emerged in the 1960s, and it's certainly dominant within computational neuroscience, which is the part of the science which I've studied most closely. But not every cognitive scientist would definitely sign themselves up for each of these points. So this thing about potential replicability of human intelligence in a machine, that's a core assumption of work on artificial general intelligence, which is having a renaissance at the moment, especially projects within deep learning. Companies like DeepMind are really invested in this assumption, but it's always had its skeptics. And of course, there are variants of the technology which would be taken to be the best model of human cognition. So back in the 70s, first generation of AI known as GoFi, good old-fashioned AI, or symbolic AI, which was using programming explicit instructions into computer codes to so that the machines could do things like general problem solving. But right now, the dominant approach in artificial intelligence is, of course, deep learning and use of artificial neural networks. So each of those are versions of computationalism. But of course, just spelling out what the computational theory of mind is prompts questions about what computation is, its relation to this notion of the mechanical. So it's here that I find looking a bit into the history, illuminating to thinking about what's really at stake here. So most textbooks accounts of computation go back to this Turing Church thesis. It was published in the 1930s, which formalized a notion that mathematicians had grasped intuitively, that for some procedures in mathematics, there are ways to execute them which are what they call mechanical, or also known as there being effective methods. In other words, these were methods which didn't require any insight or understanding of maths, just the ability to rigidly follow steps of a recipe or an algorithm, in other words. And this reduces the process of, solving a problem or calculating a result down to some set of extremely basic procedures, so simple that they can be mechanized. So Turing formalized this notion of an effective method with the concept of a Turing machine. And how he got there, what he was doing was actually a kind of simulation of the work done by human computers. So originally the word computer actually referred to a kind of laborer, someone who was sitting at a desk all day and just cranking out lots of sums. As you can see on the slide there, if you've seen the film Hidden Figures, the main characters and protagonists of the film are human computers. So a couple of quotations from Turing talking about his concept. He said that electronic computers are intended to carry out any definite rule of thumb process which could have been done by a human operator working in a disciplined but unintelligent manner. oh, sorry. And he talked about the class of problems capable of solution by the machine can be defined fairly specifically. They are a subset of those problems which can be solved by human clerical labor, working to fixed rules and without understanding. And the points that I've highlighted in these texts are that he's emphasizing that the class of calculations that the computer can do, that these operations that are mechanizable, are the ones that do not require what we think of as actual intelligence, like understanding or imagination, just only the ability to follow the rules that have been pre-specified. Okay, so that's how we define computation. About the computational theory of mind, another point about this is that it's naturalistic, and this is a term that philosophers talk about in different domains. It's about, and I'm quoting from my colleague Mark Spivak here, who writes, "The objective is to explain how a system can be mental in terms that do not already presuppose mental life." Right, so what's going on with this naturalization of the mental is showing how you can explain mental capacities, all of cognition, thoughts, feelings, memories, sensations, everything that goes on in our mental life and explains intelligent behavior or is associated with intelligent behavior, so that reduces down to operations which are not in themselves mental or cognitive, right? So it's showing how all of this mental life emerges out of a world which is fundamentally physical and not inherently mental. And so Spivak writes that cognitive science's strategy for achieving this goal is to explain mental life in terms of computations implemented by the brain. So computation being the way to show how you get from just ordinary physical matter into organized in a certain way, you get cognitive capacities. So we can think of this naturalization project as a demystification, right? Showing how something that seemed really inexplicable actually reduces to some not mysterious physical principles. So you could, and the mechanization of thought, which computationalism allows, gets you to this. So it's the reduction of apparently intelligent behavior to processes that could be carried out by mindless switches. And what goes on in computers is that you get complex performances like we see around us today in all of our devices out of some very simple steps. And I'll quote here from a philosopher, Tim Crane, explaining this principle. He writes that to design a Turing machine that will perform more complex operations, such as our multiplication algorithm of the previous section, that's a bit irrelevant, but anyway, I'll carry on. We need a more complex machine table, more internal states, more tape and a more complex notation. But this is the point to emphasize. We do not need any more sophisticated basic operations. So the most complex computational processes that we have in the world today are still built up out of the same basic steps that were invented at the birth of computation. And machine computation. So Crane goes on to say, what we have done is reduced anything we recognize as an effective procedure to a series of simple steps performed by a very simple device. These steps are so simple that it is not possible for anyone to think of them as mysterious. So you can see how you get this demystification coming out of the computational theory of mind. And I think it's, when we're talking about the context of this idea of naturalization, it's important to recognize parallels with demystification ideas that have occurred elsewhere in science. So a really obvious one that would strike you here is evolution by natural selection. So the parallel is that what Darwin or Dawkins is talking about here is that what looks to be a process requiring intelligence, in other words, the creation of species well adapted to survive in their environment, can actually be carried out by a mechanism with unintelligent primitive operations, i.e. the mechanism of natural selection, So the survival versus death of better or worse adapted variants in a population, as long as you have random mutations coming up, and as long as you have this, grim reaper just selecting, allowing some species to reproduce, some variants to reproduce and others not, then you'll get evolution and speciation. And what you do not need in this process is any foresight. Hence, this is why Dawkins refers to it as a blind process. Sorry about the ableism there, but that's Dawkins. So if you know anything about deep learning today, you'll also know that there are some deeper connections with how our most advanced AI operates and evolutionary ideas. So there's this shared core concept of optimization over a fitless landscape that is how 20th century biologists theorized evolution. And this is how deep learning, it has this mechanized optimization through gradient descent algorithms. So there's very much an evolutionary core at the heart of deep learning in terms of the principle of operation. But I'm not going to say anything more about this comparison for the rest of the talk. I'm actually going to focus on something further afield, which is from economics and political economy. So a more surprising connection maybe with a demystifying idea, which is the invisible hand. So we're in Edinburgh and we have a statue of Adam Smith on the Royal Mile. He's very much a local figure. And he's one of these philosophers whose ideas had been taken and run with in lots of ways. So I pulled this picture of the invisible hand concept from a business news website, which also had a few pages on sort of core concepts from economics. So there's this scholarly debate, many pages written about what Adam Smith himself meant by the invisible hand. One can interpret him as saying it's the hand of providence, the hand of God. There's various things that he could have meant by the invisible hand. However, what I'm focusing on here is really how this idea has been taken up in more recent popular economics. And the core point is to say that invisible hand processes are ways of saying that a free market is better than a planned economy, because it's saying that what looks to be a process requiring intelligence, like the harmonious distribution of goods in an economy, it can actually be carried out by a process with unintelligent primitive operations, or pretty much unintelligent. So you have these individual actors in a society who all they do is look at the cost benefits of their own actions with regard to their own selfish interests. They do not look any further than their own personal interests. They do not look at the effects of their actions on wider society. They don't care about that. But the point of the invisible hand mechanism is to say that all of those individuals driven by self-interest aggregated together, they will actually generate markets in which goods are distributed intelligently. So it's, if you like, demystifying the process by which an economy and society could share goods. Okay. Right. So another idea from Adam Smith, which has had an awful lot of impact on how people think of the world and how modern industry operates. Not that Adam Smith invented the idea, I should say, but he's talked about it a lot, is the idea of division of labor. So my interest in the history of computation has been very much shaped by a historian of science called Lorraine Dustin, so just flagging this paper of hers up here. And she's looking at the division of labor and drawing on some, and seeing how this shapes modern ideas about computation. And she talks about the story in terms of a three-stage, three-act process. So she begins her story not in the 17th century with the invention of simple adding machines like the Pascaline by Blaise Pascal, but actually with Adam Smith, whose book The Wealth of Nations was published in 1776. And he was very much influenced by this account in the Encyclopedia by Diderot and d'Alembert, this important Enlightenment publication, which talked about the manufacture of pins in a factory. And what they're talking about is a division of labor in which there are 18 different operations which are needed to make one individual pin, so 18 different steps that need to be carried out. And the point is that if one worker tries to do all of these operations themselves, they'll be only able to make like a couple of pins a day. However, if you divide the labor up so that each step in the manufacture has a dedicated worker doing this, then you get this massive increase of productivity. So this process of dividing labor is taken to be like the secret to how productivity increases and how economies grow and countries become more wealthy. Just to flag up one interesting point, I heard from a book by this anthropologist, Graeber, that actually the very idea of division of labor and even the example of a manufacture of pins or needles actually predates the encyclopedia by many centuries. So there's this text by the Persian scholar Ghazali called The Revival of Religious Knowledge, which actually gives this example of a needle factory and 25 different steps in manufacture. And how Graeber argues that Smith would have at least been indirectly influenced by this text. So that's an aside. I'm going to talk more about how Smith's notion is carried on in this story of computation. So the thing to talk about here is that there is this trajectory with mechanization in which you begin with like an individual laborer who's a generalist or a jack of all trades. And then to increase productivity by dividing labor up, you can actually not need skilled laborers to do this. So in Smith's account of the pin factory, the workers there were actually skilled specialists. But when the division of labor is discussed by other economists, in particular Marx, what he emphasizes is that through this process of dividing labor up, you actually don't then need skilled workers anymore. And ultimately the steps can be so made so simple that the machines can do them, right? So to quote from Karl Marx, he writes further, as the division of labor increases, labor is simplified. The special skill of the worker becomes worthless. He becomes transformed into a simple, monotonous, productive force that does not have to use intense bodily or intellectual faculties. His labor becomes a labor that anyone can perform. So in Marx, the process of division of labor is very much a prelude to mechanization and industrialization in manufacture. So what does this have to do with computation at all? Well, now we get to the next stage in the story, which is this idea about dividing labor was really at the birth of the idea of building mechanical computers. So there is this episode shortly after the French Revolution where a mathematician, Gaspard de Prony, had the idea of building a very massive, enormous table of logarithms. So obviously before, people had calculators where you could just press a button and find out what the log of any number is. You know, people were using logarithms for calculations, but they needed to refer to massive tables, which would tell them the log of a number to many decimal places. So Prony had this idea of like building the biggest logarithm table ever produced, up to 10, so each figure given up to 10 decimal places. And if you're just going to have like one, skilled mathematician just working out the logarithms for this table, it would take like many lifetimes of mathematicians to do that. But he had this idea of employing division of labor to the task, because the problems of the calculations needed to write down the logarithms could actually be reformulated into simple additions and subtractions that anyone could do. You didn't need to have any mathematical skills at all, other than just to be able to add and subtract numbers. And so by outsourcing most of this project to unskilled people that would just add and subtract, then this whole project of building the big logarithmic tables would be accelerated massively, would be done way more efficiently than it could be otherwise. And so this is what Ronnie actually did. And now finally we get to computers. So Charles Babbage was a British economist and engineer who saw what had happened with this division of labor using human unskilled workers, and had the idea, well, of course you could just build a calculating machine that could do that unskilled work of just adding and subtracting numbers, and then you could completely mechanize this process of building tables with, you know, lots of results like that. So this is a picture of Babbage's mechanical computing machine, the difference engine. And this is a quotation from his book on the economy of machinery and manufacturers, where he writes that it may appear paradoxical to some of our readers that the division of labor can be applied with equal success to mental as to mechanical operations. But he says that it ensures, just as with manufacture in a factory, it ensures economy of labor and time. So it, just as much as in, you know, a factory in which you're doing weaving or spinning cotton, you can increase productivity by mechanization of this mental labor of doing calculations. And this is a table from the book by Babbage, which is showing you how this process occurs. So he's talking about, you know, building a table which tells you the square of any number, and he's showing how that the calculation of working out the square of a number can be broken down into this sequence of calculations in which you just add 2 to the numbers in one column, and then you add the result of the column B to column A, and then you get the square of ever bigger numbers. So it makes this process all very simple. I'll let you read that on the slide yourself. So he's saying, I also have this quotation here. He's basically saying how, you know, this removes any mystery about how these calculations could be mechanized. Okay, so one thing to think about is the parallel here between machine manufacture and what computers are, is that what you're doing in both cases is getting, you know, thoughtless parts like the cogs of a machine and assembling them so that they imitate the skilled action of a human worker. So just as much as in a cotton mill, you know, the work that was originally done by a weaver who is a skilled, someone with actual manual skills, and then that gets replicated in machines which have no skills. They're not the kind of things that have skills, they're just parts arranged together. Well, you can also have certain thought processes duplicated in a machine which has, you know, no skills, no intelligence in its parts. So with this story in the background, thinking, what are the implications for how we understand the computational theory of mind? The CTM is the claim that cognition is essentially computation. But as I'll argue in the rest of the talk, when it's viewed with this historical eye, it seems that there are limitations on the inferences that we can make from the behavior of computers to humans. So the first point is that when you mechanize a task, you're adapting the process. you're not getting the machine to do the task in the same way that a human would do it. So Daston makes this point that, you know, mechanical weaving looms did not operate in the way that human weavers did. There's this sequencing of tasks, which it goes on in this process of dividing labor and reducing the skill burden for any of these tasks. And so the machine does things in a way that for a human would be counterintuitive or just not the same. So the basic point here that we can draw with the CTM is just because a computer does something which seems like the same as an intelligent behavior that a human does, it doesn't mean that they're actually using any of the same skills that a human would take to do it. You know, it would be a false inference to just assume that the computational duplication of a human cognitive process is actually revealing how the human does it. It's because of this process that has to take place when you mechanize. So there's something like more to be said about the process of, you know, unskilling that occurs through mechanization. So this is something that Adam Smith himself worried about in another passage in The Wealth of Nations. He talks about how when workers have to take on jobs in which, as he says, they're performing a few simple operations of which the effects are perhaps always the same or very nearly the same, so just very repetitive work, and there's no occasion for the worker to exercise his understanding or powers of invention. What Smith says is that a worker in that circumstance loses the habit of using their minds, and he worries that they become as stupid and as ignorant as it's possible for a human creature to become. So the point being here is that he recognized that through certain kinds of routinization of works, or having people in their own labor doing things which was just equivalent to how a machine would do, it's not drawing on human capacities and skills in the same way that non-mechanized labor contexts would do. So there's this relevant point when we're thinking about the CTM, is that this process of reconfiguring manufacturing process into simple routinized tasks means that less intelligence is needed to perform them than previously. And I think this point is very important to how we evaluate this idea about naturalizing the mind. So the CTM makes this inference from computer performance to human cognition. So you begin with this intelligent human who's a generalist that can do a whole bunch of things, has understanding and imagination, and can adapt their behavior to novel circumstances. So that's the human that you begin with. And then the way that the computational theory of mind proposes to explain those general capacities is to imagine that the human cognizer is just a set of different, if you like, expert systems. So you have perceptual systems, action planning systems, motor control systems. These are all different ways that, you know, cognitive scientists might, you know, carve up the capacities of a human mind. And then the crucial step to explain this is to show how those processes of the expert system could be duplicated by machines, which, i.e. computers, which are only capable of very basic operations. So you can see how the pattern of explanation in cognitive science, this development, this, you know, this generation of a computer model for a human cognitive capacity has a clear parallel with this division of labor pathway. But what we learned from the division of labor pathway is that you can't assume that the way your basic operations or unskilled machinic operations are doing things at the end of this process of division is actually the same as the way that something was done to be at the beginning before this division of labor. So I think a particularly revealing or part of this, or something to be emphasized, can highlight again from the passage from Adam Smith, is that the worker in a factory just doing routine repetitive tasks has no occasion to exert his understanding or to exercise his invention in finding out expedients for removing difficulties, because such difficulties never occur. So the point is that in this factory setting, the environment is so controlled that there isn't the opportunity for using greater intelligence, just because there's never any change or novel situation in which you'd have to improvise or think of some new way of doing things. And that's what he's saying is particularly stultifying about repetitive work, is that it's always the same, and so you never have to improvise and solve problems, figure stuff out. And there's an important point about mechanized labor which needs to be noted here, which is that it's only possible through the standardization and routinization of the environment and the task to be performed. And if you look at, where actual machines like robots do best, it is in highly controlled circumstances. So if we look at, the success stories of robotics today, it's an industry. Like, robots do really well in the controlled setting of a factory, doing things like building cars. But if you look at the performance of robots or robotic systems, computer-controlled autonomous systems like this Uber self-driving car, if you look at their performance in uncontrolled environments, so just driving around road traffic, they actually show real limitations. So I used to live in Pittsburgh a year ago. So this is actually a picture of Pittsburgh, and there are a lot of Uber autonomous cars being driven around because Uber had picked Pittsburgh as the place to do this development, because it's actually a particularly challenging city. So there's extreme weathers. It goes from really freezing in the winter to really hot in the summer. There's a lot of hills. The driving culture is a little bit erratic. There's a lot of narrow streets for an American city. So this was taken as a tough challenge for autonomous vehicles, and they actually didn't do very well. They always needed a human test driver around keeping up on things, because they just didn't manage to deal with novel situations, which there always are in real traffic in a city like this. So the point being is that outside of controlled conditions, this lack of ability for computational devices to improvise, to adapt their behavior flexibly, they start to show themselves. Okay. So one way to summarize this is to say that machines thrive in micro worlds. So if you know anything about the history of AI, especially symbolic AI, you would have heard of this concept of micro worlds. And this is like a mini world that programmers like Winograd thought of as, if you like, mini systems in which you could build a program that would be able to like answer all of the possible questions that there would be about their world. So there's this program called Shirldo, which had a micro world which only consisted of blocks and pyramids, and it could have a dialogue with you about what was going on with blocks and pyramids. It could do that perfectly, but that was all it knew. And the point being that in these closed environments, it's quite easy to get a machine to do everything that needs to be done. But the real challenge with building intelligent computational systems today is actually getting things that deal with, weird, unexpected stuff, as I've just said. So this is a point made by sociologist of science, Harry Collins, like thinking about the limitations and then the potential of computers. And he makes the point that, you know, humans ourselves, we sometimes make micro worlds. So he thinks of the factory as like a micro world in which humans have to behave in this machinic way, doing the same thing over and over again. And there's just a limited number of things that can happen. So thinking about the potential of computers to be taking over jobs in the real world, it really depends on people making the right environments, the right micro world environments in which the computers can do well. So getting, and so this brings up this point about when we're asking questions about, you know, the capacity of machines to be intelligent like us, we're often impressed by some performance of a machine, but then forgetting that the machine performance is actually the result of a collaboration between a human and the machine. So just to refer back to this division of labor pyramid that we saw with Prony's logarithm table, it's not as if the skilled mathematicians disappeared from the project and it was completely mechanized. It's just all of that routine work was taken over by unskilled operations. So it seems like there's a lesson here for how we understand the performances of computers today. If we take seriously that this is still the model for how mechanization of mental labor is working, it's not like the skilled intelligence of like the expert human actually can afford to disappear. And this is a concern about how, you know, AI and algorithmic decision-making is being used today. It's been taken to be capable of being more autonomous than it often is, and with bad results of not realizing that for a good artificial intelligence performance, a human still needs to be collaborating with the machine. So this is going on to a summary of what I've said so far. So firstly, the computational theory of mind seeks to demystify or naturalize thought by reducing cognition to mechanical, in other words, computational processes. The history of computation tracks the history of mechanized manufacture and the de-skilling of a human labor force. So mechanization requires restructuring, not duplication of the tasks performed by the skilled worker. So the point, then this was the point about it being misleading to think that if you've mechanized some process, you've actually revealed how the process originally worked. The point being that mechanization of a task always involves restructuring of the task. And mechanization also requires control of the environment so that understanding and invention is not demanded of machines or unskilled workers. So what we should remember is that intelligence attributed to machine, like an AI, is the intelligence of a human-machine collaboration. And finally, and this is a rhetorical question, so is computation, with all this in mind, can it really be thought to be the right framework for theorizing general human intelligence in the uncontrolled world? And I've listed here a bunch of the sources that I referred to in the talk in case you wanted to follow up on any of those. So thank you.